Welcome back, dear listeners, to another captivating tale from History Bedtime Stories. Tonight, we journey to the windswept fjords of Norway and the rolling hills of northern France to tell the extraordinary story of a man whose life bridged two worlds and changed the course of European history forever. This is the tale of Rollo the Walker, a towering Viking warrior whose very footsteps shook the earth, whose longship struck terror into the hearts of medieval Europe, and whose unlikely transformation from savage raider to noble ruler would lay the foundation for one of the most powerful dynasties in European history. Our story begins in the late 9th century, when the sound of Viking war horns echoed across the seas, when dragon-headed ships appeared like phantoms through morning mists, and when the very mention of Norsemen could empty entire villages. But this isn't just another tale of Viking raids and plunder. From the frozen fjords of his Norwegian homeland to the fertile valleys of what would become Normandy, from pagan war chief to Christian duke, Rollo's journey represents one of history's most remarkable transformations. His descendants would go on to conquer England, establish kingdoms in Sicily and the Holy Land, and shape the political landscape of Europe for centuries to come. So settle in, close your eyes, and let your imagination carry you back over 1,000 years, to an age of sail and sword, of kings and warriors, of faith and conquest. Tonight, we tell the story of Rollo, the Viking who became a duke, the raider who became a ruler, and the Norseman whose legacy echoes through history to this very day. But before our journey begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple way to support the channel. I am also always curious to know where in the world and at what time are you joining me tonight. So, I would really love to hear from you in the comments. To understand the story of Rollo, we must first understand the world that forged him. The late 8th and early 9th centuries marked the beginning of what historians call the Viking Age, a period of Scandinavian expansion that would reshape Europe, reach across the Atlantic to the Americas, and penetrate deep into Russia and the Byzantine Empire. In the harsh and beautiful landscapes of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, a warrior culture had emerged that valued courage above life itself, honored strength and cunning, and worshipped gods of war and wisdom. These were the Norsemen, the men from the north, who would become known to their victims simply as Vikings, a word that may have meant baymen or pirates in their ancient tongue. The reasons for the great Viking expansion are still debated by scholars today. Some point to population pressure in Scandinavia, where the rocky and mountainous terrain could support only limited agriculture. Others suggest that political consolidation under increasingly powerful kings drove ambitious young warriors to seek their fortunes abroad. Climate change may have played a role too. The medieval warm period made sea travel easier and opened new routes to distant lands. But perhaps most importantly, the Vikings possessed something that gave them an overwhelming advantage in this age of expansion: superior maritime technology. The Viking longship was a masterpiece of engineering, shallow-drafted enough to navigate rivers deep into continental Europe, yet seaworthy enough to cross the North Atlantic. These elegant vessels, with their distinctive dragon heads and square sails, could carry 30 to 60 warriors at speeds that allowed them to appear suddenly out of the morning mist, strike with devastating effect, and vanish before local forces could organize a defense. The first recorded Viking raid occurred in 793 CE, when Norse warriors descended upon the monastery of Lindisfarne off the coast of northern England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the terror of that day. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The monks were slaughtered, the monastery's treasures plundered, and survivors carried off as slaves. It was a harbinger of centuries of raids to come. But the Vikings were not merely destroyers. They were also explorers, traders, and settlers who established trading networks that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople. They founded cities like Dublin, York, and Kiev. They served as mercenaries in the Byzantine Empire and explored the coasts of North America centuries before Columbus. They were farmers and craftsmen, poets and lawmakers who created sophisticated societies with complex legal codes and rich literary traditions. This was the world that shaped Rollo, a world where a man's worth was measured by his courage in battle, his generosity to his followers, and his ability to win wealth and honor through his own strength and cunning. It was a world that produced adventurers and conquerors, but also pragmatists who could adapt to new circumstances and embrace new opportunities. Norway in the late 9th century was undergoing a period of tremendous upheaval. Harald Fairhair, the first king to claim rule over all Norway, was consolidating his power through a series of brutal campaigns against local chieftains and petty kings. Many of these defeated nobles and their followers chose exile rather than submission, setting sail for new lands where they could maintain their independence and traditional way of life. It was into this turbulent world that Rollo was born, probably around 860 CE, though the exact date and even his birthplace remain matters of scholarly debate. What we know of his early life comes to us through a mixture of historical records, saga literature, and archaeological evidence, woven together by generations of historians into a narrative that, while not always certain in its details, captures the essence of one of the most consequential lives of the early medieval period. The man who would become known to history as Rollo was born, according to most accounts, somewhere in the western regions of Norway, possibly in the area around the Romsdal Valley. His birth name was likely Rolf, meaning famous wolf, though this too is not certain. In the Norse tradition, children were often named for the qualities their parents hoped they would embody, and the wolf was a symbol of ferocity, cunning, and loyalty to the pack. From the beginning, Rollo was marked as extraordinary. Medieval sources describe him as a giant among men, so tall and broad that no horse could carry him, earning him the nickname Gangorolfr or Rollo the Walker. While such descriptions should be taken with some skepticism, medieval writers often embellished the physical attributes of their subjects. There seems little doubt that Rollo was an imposing figure whose very presence commanded attention and respect. Growing up in a Norse household of the 9th century meant growing up in a world where violence was a constant possibility and martial skill a necessity for survival. From childhood, Rollo would have been trained in the use of weapons, the sword, spear, axe, and shield that were the tools of a warrior's trade. He would have learned to read the signs of weather and tide, to navigate by the stars, and to understand the complex web of kinship, honor, and obligation that bound Norse society together. The education of a young Norse noble went beyond the merely practical. Rollo would have been steeped in the rich oral tradition of his people, the sagas and eddas that told of gods and heroes, of great deeds and tragic fates, of the eternal struggle between order and chaos that the Norse believed lay at the heart of existence. These stories were not mere entertainment. They were the cultural DNA of Viking society, transmitting values, expectations, and worldviews from one generation to the next. Central to this worldview was the concept of WYRD, fate or destiny, but not a passive fate that mortals must simply accept. Rather, the Norse believed that while the broad outlines of a man's destiny might be fixed, he had considerable freedom in how he chose to meet that destiny. Courage, honor, and achievement in this life were what mattered. Death came to all men, but fame could be eternal. This philosophy created a culture that celebrated risk-taking, individual achievement, and above all, the willingness to seize opportunity when it presented itself. For young men like Rollo, growing up in this tradition, the great Viking expeditions that were beginning to range across Europe represented not just opportunities for wealth and adventure, but chances to write their names in the imperishable record of heroic deeds. The political situation in Norway during Rollo's youth provided ample motivation for such expeditions. Harald Fairhair's campaign to unite Norway under his rule was creating a steady stream of exiles, proud chieftains and their followers who refused to bend the knee to any overlord. Many of these exiles turned to the sea, joining the great Viking expeditions that were already probing the coasts of Britain, Ireland, and the Frankish kingdoms. According to some sources, Rollo's own family may have been among those displaced by Harald's consolidation of power. The Heimskringla, a collection of Norse sagas compiled by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, tells us that Rollo was the son of Ragnvald, Earl of Moor, one of Harald's most trusted allies. In this version of events, Rollo was exiled not because his family opposed Harald, but because of his own actions. The story, as Snorri tells it, is that Rollo became involved in raiding within Norway itself, a violation of the peace that Harald was trying to establish. When Harald decreed that Rollo should be outlawed, even Ragnvald could not protect his son. Faced with exile or death, Rollo chose to leave Norway forever, gathering a band of followers and setting sail for the west. Other sources suggest different origins for Rollo, some placing him in Denmark rather than Norway, others suggesting he was already an established leader of Viking expeditions when he first appears in historical records. What seems certain is that by the late 9th century, a Viking leader known as Rollo had emerged as one of the most formidable raiders operating in the waters around Britain and the Frankish coast. The transition from local Norwegian politics to international Viking raider would have been a natural one for a man of Rollo's background and ambitions. The basic unit of Viking expansion was the ship's crew, typically 20 to 60 men bound together by oaths of loyalty to their leader. These crews were often composed of kinsmen, friends, and sworn companions who had chosen to follow a particular chief in pursuit of wealth and glory. Leadership of such a band required not only martial prowess, but also the political skills necessary to hold together a group of independent-minded warriors, the strategic vision to identify profitable targets, and the tactical ability to execute successful raids. A successful Viking leader needed to be part warrior, part diplomat, part entrepreneur, and part inspirational speaker. As Rollo began his career as a Viking raider, probably in the 880s or 890s, he would have learned these skills through experience. Early raids might have been modest affairs, attacks on isolated monasteries or poorly defended coastal settlements. But as his reputation grew and more warriors chose to follow him, Rollo would have been able to contemplate more ambitious targets. The world that lay before him was rich with opportunity. The Carolingian Empire, which had dominated Western Europe for more than a century, was beginning to fragment. The death of Charlemagne in 814 had begun a process of division that would eventually split his empire into separate kingdoms. These political divisions created weaknesses that Viking raiders were quick to exploit. In England, the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were locked in constant warfare with each other and with the Vikings who had already established settlements in the north and east. Ireland was similarly divided, with dozens of small kingdoms providing rich pickings for well-organized raiders. And France, the western portion of Charlemagne's old empire, was perhaps the most tempting target of all, with its wealthy monasteries, prosperous towns, and river systems that allowed Viking longships to penetrate deep into the continental interior. It was toward France that Rollo would eventually turn his attention, beginning a series of campaigns that would culminate in one of the most dramatic transformations in medieval European history. But first, he needed to establish himself as a Viking leader worthy of such ambitions. The late 9th century witnessed an intensification of Viking activity across Western Europe that medieval chroniclers described in terms of apocalyptic terror. Year after year, the dragon-headed ships appeared with the spring sailing season, their crews spreading destruction along the coasts and penetrating ever deeper into the river systems of the continent. For the victims of these raids, the Vikings seemed to represent something beyond ordinary warfare. A force of pure destruction that struck without warning and vanished without trace, leaving behind only burning settlements and traumatized survivors. The monk Ermentarius of Normutjer captured this sense of helpless terror in his vivid account. The number of ships grows. The endless stream of Vikings never ceases to increase. Everywhere the Christians are victims of massacres, burnings, plunderings. The Vikings conquer all in their path, and no one resists them. But from the Viking perspective, these raids represented something quite different. Calculated military and economic enterprises designed to extract maximum wealth with minimum risk. The Vikings had developed raiding into a sophisticated art form, with established patterns of seasonal campaigning, intelligence networks that identified the most profitable targets, and tactical innovations that maximized their advantages while minimizing their vulnerabilities. The key to Viking success lay in their mobility and their intimate knowledge of coastal and riverine geography. A Viking fleet could appear off a target with no warning, land its forces at dawn, overwhelm local defenses through superior organization and equipment, gather plunder and captives, and be back aboard ship and away before any relief force could arrive. The psychological impact of such raids was often as valuable as the material gains, as communities would frequently pay tribute rather than face attack. It was into this world of organized raiding that Rollo launched his career as a Viking leader. By the 890s, he had assembled a formidable following and was operating in the waters around the British Isles and the northern coast of France. The fragmentary nature of our sources makes it difficult to trace his movements with precision, but it's clear that he quickly established a reputation as one of the most capable and dangerous Viking commanders of his generation. Rollo's early raids probably followed the established Viking pattern. He would have targeted monasteries, which were often wealthy but lightly defended, and coastal settlements that could be struck quickly before local forces could respond. The wealth accumulated from these raids would have allowed him to attract more followers and equip them with the weapons and equipment necessary for more ambitious operations. The monk chroniclers who recorded these raids naturally focused on the destruction and suffering they caused, but modern historians recognize that Viking raiding also had profound economic and political effects. The wealth that flowed back to Scandinavia from these expeditions helped finance the development of more centralized kingdoms there, while the constant threat of Viking attack forced European rulers to develop new defensive strategies and military technologies. In England, the pressure of Viking raids and settlement had already forced the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to adapt or perish. Wessex under Alfred the Great had developed a system of fortified towns, and a reorganized military that could respond more effectively to Viking threats. The Danelaw, the portion of England under Viking control, had become a hybrid society that blended Norse and Anglo-Saxon traditions. France presented a different but equally complex picture. The Carolingian Empire was fragmenting into smaller kingdoms as descendants of Charlemagne fought among themselves for supremacy. This political fragmentation made coordinated defense against Viking raids extremely difficult, as local rulers were often more concerned with their own survival than with presenting a united front against external threats. The geography of France also favored Viking raiders. The great river systems, the Seine, Loire, Garonne, and Rhone, provided highways that allowed Viking fleets to penetrate hundreds of miles into the continental interior. Paris, the symbolic heart of the Frankish realm, was accessible to Viking ships via the Seine, while the wealthy monasteries of the Loire Valley lay open to raiders who could navigate that river's treacherous currents. It was probably in the mid-890s that Rollo first turned his attention seriously toward France. By this time, he had accumulated considerable experience as a raider and had built up a substantial following. Some sources suggest that he may have participated in the Great Viking Siege of Paris in 885 to 886, though this is not certain. What is clear is that by the end of the 9th century, Rollo had identified the Seine Valley as a particularly attractive target for his operations. The Seine offered everything a Viking raider could want: a navigable waterway that led deep into rich countryside, numerous wealthy targets along its banks, and a political situation that made coordinated defense difficult. The river passed through the heart of the Kingdom of West Francia, but the kingdom was weakened by succession disputes and internal conflicts that had left many regions effectively defenseless. Rollo's decision to focus his activities on the Seine Valley would prove to be one of the most consequential strategic choices in medieval European history. Unlike previous Viking raiders who had treated France as a source of temporary plunder, Rollo seems to have recognized the possibility of establishing a more permanent presence in the region. Whether this was part of a calculated long-term strategy or simply the result of tactical success that opened up unexpected opportunities remains a subject of debate among historians. What we know is that by around 900, Rollo had established what was effectively a Viking principality centered on the mouth of the Seine. Using the island of Jaffa as a base, his forces controlled river traffic and could strike at targets throughout the region. This was a significant escalation from traditional hit-and-run raiding. It represented an attempt to control territory and extract systematic tribute from the surrounding population. The establishment of this Seine Valley stronghold brought Rollo into direct conflict with the Frankish nobility and ultimately with the king himself. It also marked the beginning of the process that would transform him from a pagan Viking raider into the Christian Duke of Normandy. But that transformation was still years away, and it would require a series of dramatic confrontations that would test both his military skills and his political acumen to their limits. In the early years of the 10th century, Rollo's Viking fleet controlled the Seine estuary with an iron grip. From his fortified base, his raiders struck repeatedly at the rich countryside of northern France, their longships appearing suddenly at dawn to devastate monasteries, towns, and villages before vanishing back downriver with their plunder and captives. The chroniclers of the time paint a picture of systematic terror. The Annals of St. Vast record that the Northmen ceaselessly devastated Gaul, while the abbot of Saint-Germain-des-Prés wrote that no village, no town, no monastery could remain safe from their fury. But behind these accounts of destruction lay a more sophisticated reality. Rollo was not conducting random raids, but implementing a strategic campaign designed to establish permanent control over the Seine Valley. The key to understanding Rollo's strategy lies in recognizing that by this time, he was thinking like a ruler rather than a raider. The traditional Viking approach of quick strikes followed by withdrawal was giving way to a new model based on territorial control and systematic exploitation of conquered regions. Rollo was establishing what historians now recognize as one of the first Viking principalities, a hybrid political entity that combined Norse military traditions with Frankish administrative practices. This transformation did not go unnoticed by the Frankish authorities. Charles the Simple, King of West Francia, was under enormous pressure from his nobles and clergy to deal with the Viking threat. The presence of a permanent Viking base in the heart of his kingdom was not just a military problem but a challenge to the very legitimacy of royal authority. If the king could not protect his subjects from pagan raiders, what was the point of royal government? The situation came to a head around 910, when Rollo launched what appears to have been his most ambitious campaign yet, a direct assault on Paris itself. The city, located on the Isle de la site in the middle of the Seine, was the symbolic heart of the Frankish kingdom and one of the most heavily fortified positions in Western Europe. An attack on Paris was not just a raid. It was a direct challenge to royal authority that demanded a response. The Siege of Paris by Rollo's forces was a masterpiece of Viking military engineering. Unlike the earlier siege of 885 to 886, which had relied primarily on blockade and starvation, Rollo employed sophisticated siege techniques that demonstrated the evolution of Viking military capabilities. His forces constructed siege towers, deployed catapults, and attempted to undermine the city's walls through systematic excavation. The defenders, led by the Count of Paris and strengthened by royal reinforcements, fought with desperate courage. The city's strategic position on an island in the Seine made it extremely difficult to attack, while its strong walls and experienced garrison meant that any assault would be costly. Contemporary accounts describe weeks of fighting in which both sides displayed remarkable bravery and tactical skill. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the siege was not the fighting itself, but the negotiations that took place during lulls in the combat. For the first time, Frankish authorities were treating with Rollo not as a bandit chief to be eliminated, but as a political leader with whom diplomatic business could be conducted. Representatives of King Charles the Simple met with Rollo under flags of truce, exploring the possibility of a negotiated settlement that might end the Viking threat while preserving royal dignity. These negotiations revealed the fundamental transformation that had taken place in Rollo's position. He was no longer simply a Viking raider seeking plunder, but the de facto ruler of a significant territory with political objectives that extended beyond mere material gain. His demands included not just tribute payments but recognition of his control over the lands he had conquered and guarantees of peaceful relations with the Frankish kingdom. The siege dragged on through the summer and into the autumn of 910. Neither side could achieve a decisive victory. Rollo lacked the resources for a prolonged siege, while the Frankish forces were unable to break the Viking blockade of the river. As winter approached, both sides had strong incentives to seek a negotiated settlement. The exact details of how the siege ended remain unclear, as different sources provide conflicting accounts. Some suggest that Rollo was eventually forced to withdraw in the face of superior Frankish numbers, while others indicate that he achieved many of his objectives through negotiation. What seems certain is that the siege marked a turning point in the relationship between the Vikings and the Frankish kingdom. For Rollo, the siege demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of his position. His forces had shown that they could threaten even the most important centers of Frankish power, but they had also revealed that the kingdom retained sufficient military strength to resist direct conquest. The siege had also provided an opportunity for diplomatic contact that would prove crucial in future negotiations. For the Frankish kingdom, the siege was a wake-up call that forced a fundamental reassessment of how to deal with the Viking threat. Traditional military responses had proven inadequate. The Vikings could not be definitively defeated in battle, nor could they be permanently expelled from French territory. New approaches were needed, approaches that might involve accommodation rather than elimination of the Viking presence. In the months following the siege, both sides seemed to have engaged in intensive diplomatic activity. Rollo was in contact not only with King Charles the Simple, but with various Frankish nobles who were exploring the possibility of using Viking military strength for their own political purposes. The Vikings, for their part, were beginning to recognize that their long-term security might depend on achieving some form of legal recognition from the Frankish authorities. The year 911 dawned with Rollo's Viking forces still firmly entrenched in their Seine Valley stronghold, while King Charles the Simple faced mounting pressure from his nobles to find a solution to the Norse problem. The traditional approach of military confrontation had proven costly and ineffective. The Vikings could not be defeated decisively in battle, nor could they be expelled permanently from French territory. It was against this background of military stalemate that both sides began to explore the possibility of a negotiated settlement that would address their fundamental concerns. For Charles, the primary objective was to neutralize the Viking threat and restore royal authority over the affected territories. For Rollo, the goal was to secure legal recognition of his conquests and establish a stable foundation for his followers' continued presence in France. The negotiations that led to the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte were conducted through intermediaries and took place over several months. The Frankish side was represented by Archbishop Franco of Rouen, a skilled diplomat who had experience in dealing with Viking leaders. Rollo's interests were advocated by members of his inner circle who had learned enough of Frankish political culture to navigate the complex world of medieval diplomacy. The treaty itself, signed in 911 at Saint-Clair-sur-Epte on the river Epte, was a masterpiece of medieval diplomatic compromise. In its terms, we can see both sides making significant concessions while achieving their most important objectives. For historians, the treaty represents one of the most significant documents of the early medieval period, an agreement that would create a new political entity and establish precedents that would influence European development for centuries to come. The core of the agreement was elegantly simple. Rollo would be granted the title of Duke and given control over a large territory in northwestern France, roughly corresponding to what we now call Lower Normandy. In return, he would swear fealty to King Charles, convert to Christianity, and undertake to defend his new duchy against other Viking raiders. But the apparent simplicity of these terms concealed a revolutionary transformation in medieval political practice. For the first time in the history of Christian Europe, a pagan Viking leader was being formally recognized as a legitimate ruler and integrated into the feudal hierarchy. The treaty was creating a new model for dealing with Viking settlement that would be copied in other parts of Europe. The territorial provisions of the treaty were carefully crafted to serve both sides' interests. The duchy that was granted to Rollo included the coastal regions where his forces were already established, but also extended inland to include areas that had been devastated by Viking raids and were in need of reconstruction. By making Rollo responsible for these territories, Charles was effectively outsourcing the problem of reconstruction to someone who had both the military strength and the economic incentive to restore order. The boundaries of the new duchy were defined with reference to natural features, rivers, forests, and hills that could be easily identified and defended. The territory included the important ports of Rouen and Harfleur, giving Rollo control over maritime trade, but also encompassed agricultural regions that could support a substantial population. The duchy was large enough to accommodate Rollo's followers and their descendants, but not so large as to pose a fundamental threat to the Frankish kingdom. The religious provisions of the treaty were perhaps even more significant than the territorial ones. Rollo's conversion to Christianity was not merely a personal matter, but a political act that symbolized the integration of the Viking settlers into Christian European society. The conversion ceremony, which took place shortly after the treaty was signed, was conducted with great pomp and ceremony, emphasizing the significance of this transformation. According to the chronicler Dudo of St. Quentin, whose account was written about a century later and may contain legendary elements, Rollo's baptism was performed by Archbishop Franco in the Cathedral of Rouen. The Viking leader took the Christian name Robert, probably in honor of Robert, Count of Paris, who had played a key role in the negotiations. The ceremony was witnessed by Frankish nobles and clergy, symbolically marking Rollo's acceptance into the Christian community. The conversion was not merely symbolic. It carried with it specific obligations that would fundamentally alter the character of the Viking settlement in Normandy. As a Christian ruler, Rollo was expected to support the church, protect clergy and church property, and promote the Christianization of his followers. This meant that the pagan warrior culture that had sustained the Viking raids would need to evolve into something new. A hybrid society that combined Norse traditions with Christian values. The feudal provisions of the treaty were equally revolutionary. By swearing fealty to Charles the Simple, Rollo was accepting a subordinate position within the Frankish political hierarchy. This was a dramatic departure from traditional Viking political culture, which emphasized the independence of warrior leaders and their personal followings. The act of homage was deeply symbolic. It represented Rollo's formal acceptance of Christian kingship and feudal obligation. But the treaty also recognized Rollo's practical autonomy within his duchy. The military provisions of the treaty were perhaps the most pragmatic aspect of the agreement. The ceremony at which the treaty was formally concluded has been described by several contemporary sources, though their accounts differ in details. What seems certain is that the occasion was marked by elaborate ritual that emphasized both the solemnity of the agreement and the transformation that it represented. Rollo is said to have initially refused to kiss the king's foot, as required by feudal protocol, but eventually consented to have one of his followers perform the ceremony on his behalf. This detail, whether historically accurate or not, captures something important about the nature of the transformation that was taking place. Rollo was accepting the forms of feudal subordination, but he was doing so on his own terms and in ways that preserved his dignity as a warrior leader. The treaty was creating something new, a hybrid political arrangement that combined elements of both Viking and Frankish political culture. The transformation of Rollo from Viking raider to Christian duke was not accomplished overnight by the signing of a treaty. The years following the agreement at Saint-Clair-sur-Epte would test his political skills, his ability to adapt to new circumstances, and his capacity to lead his followers through a fundamental transformation of their society and identity. The immediate challenge facing Rollo was how to govern a territory that had been devastated by decades of warfare. The lands that comprised his new duchy had suffered not only from Viking raids, but from the broader breakdown of Carolingian authority that had afflicted much of France in the late 9th and early 10th centuries. Towns had been abandoned, monasteries destroyed, and agricultural production severely disrupted. The population that remained was traumatized, impoverished, and deeply suspicious of their new Viking rulers. Rollo's response to these challenges revealed the pragmatic intelligence that had made him successful as a military leader. Rather than attempting to impose a purely Norse system of government on his new subjects, he chose to adapt existing Frankish institutions to his own purposes while gradually introducing his followers to the responsibilities of territorial administration. One of his first priorities was the restoration of economic activity. The Seine Valley had traditionally been one of the most prosperous regions of France, with a thriving agriculture supplemented by river trade and craft production. But the disruption of the preceding decades had reduced much of the area to poverty and disorder. Rollo understood that his long-term success depended on restoring prosperity to the region. To achieve this goal, he implemented a series of policies designed to encourage resettlement and economic recovery. He offered protection to farmers who were willing to return to abandoned lands, guaranteed safe passage to merchants who wished to resume trade along the Seine, and provided security for craftsmen who could contribute to urban reconstruction. These policies were backed by the military strength of his followers, who were now serving as a territorial police force rather than raiders. The integration of his Viking followers into this new role required considerable skill and diplomacy. Many of these men had spent their adult lives as warriors whose primary occupation was raiding and warfare. The transition to serving as administrators, tax collectors, and peacekeepers was not an easy one. Rollo needed to find ways to maintain their loyalty while channeling their energies in new directions. Part of his solution was to adopt a policy of gradual integration with the existing Frankish population. Rather than establishing a purely segregated Viking settlement, he encouraged intermarriage between his followers and local women. This policy served multiple purposes. It helped to stabilize his military force by giving the Vikings local ties and interests. It facilitated cultural exchange between the two populations, and it created a new generation that would be naturally adapted to the hybrid society that Normandy was becoming. The religious dimension of this transformation was particularly complex. Rollo's own conversion to Christianity was a political necessity, but the Christianization of his followers was a more gradual process that required careful management. Many of the Vikings had strong attachments to their traditional gods and religious practices, and forcing rapid conversion might have provoked resistance or rebellion. Rollo's approach was to lead by example while allowing the process of religious change to occur naturally over time. He patronized the reconstruction of churches and monasteries, appointed Christian clergy to positions of influence, and ensured that his own court observed Christian practices. But he also avoided persecuting those who remained attached to the old ways, understanding that religious transformation would need to accompany rather than precede social and cultural change. The establishment of Rouen as his capital was a crucial element in this transformation. The city, which had been one of the most important urban centers of the Carolingian Empire, had been severely damaged by Viking raids but retained its strategic importance as a port and administrative center. Rollo invested heavily in the city's reconstruction, building new fortifications, encouraging commercial activity, and establishing it as the seat of ducal government. The choice of Rouen as capital was symbolically significant as well. By establishing himself in a traditional Frankish city rather than creating a new Viking stronghold, Rollo was signaling his intention to rule as a legitimate heir to Carolingian authority rather than as a foreign conqueror. The city became a visible symbol of the new Norman identity that was emerging, a hybrid culture that combined the best elements of both Viking and Frankish traditions. The legal and administrative systems that Rollo established in Normandy reflected this hybrid character. Rather than imposing pure Norse law on his subjects, he adapted existing Frankish legal codes to incorporate Norse practices and principles. The result was a distinctive Norman legal tradition that would later influence legal development throughout the Norman sphere of influence. One of the most important innovations was the development of a new approach to military organization. The traditional Viking system based on personal loyalty to a war leader was adapted to create a more formal feudal structure that could provide both local defense and territorial administration. Viking warriors became Norman knights, owing service to the Duke in exchange for grants of land and the right to govern local populations. This transformation was not without its challenges. Some of Rollo's original followers were uncomfortable with the changes that were taking place, and there were occasional tensions between Old Guard Vikings and those who embraced the new Norman identity more enthusiastically. Rollo needed all his political skills to manage these internal divisions while maintaining the external facade of unified ducal authority. The success of his policies became evident in the remarkable recovery that Normandy experienced during the early years of his rule. Archaeological evidence suggests that population levels began to recover rapidly. New settlements were established, and economic activity resumed throughout the duchy. The restoration of monastic life was particularly striking. Monasteries that had been destroyed by Viking raids were rebuilt and re-endowed, often with support from the same Viking leaders who had originally destroyed them. Perhaps most significantly, Rollo began to establish the institutional foundations that would make Normandy one of medieval Europe's most effective states. He created a ducal administration that could collect taxes, maintain order, and coordinate military activities across his territory. He established relationships with neighboring rulers that provided security and opportunities for trade. And he began the process of cultural synthesis that would create the distinctive Norman identity. As Rollo entered his 6th decade of life, his thoughts increasingly turned to the question of succession. The duchy he had created was still essentially a personal achievement, held together by his own authority, dependent on his military reputation, and vulnerable to the internal divisions that had plagued so many early medieval states upon the death of their founders. The challenge of creating a stable succession was complicated by the hybrid nature of Norman society. Viking tradition emphasized the importance of personal leadership and the right of successful war leaders to rule through their own strength and charisma. Frankish tradition, by contrast, was moving toward more formalized concepts of hereditary rule and institutional continuity. Rollo needed to find a way to combine these different approaches in a system that would preserve Norman independence while ensuring internal stability. His solution was characteristically pragmatic and far-sighted. Rather than relying solely on either Viking or Frankish precedents, he created a new model of succession that drew on the strengths of both traditions while adapting to the specific circumstances of Norman society. This model would prove so successful that it would become the foundation for one of medieval Europe's most enduring dynasties. The key figure in Rollo's succession planning was his son William, known to history as William Longsword. Born probably around 900, William represented the first generation of Normans who had grown up entirely within the new hybrid culture that his father had created. Unlike Rollo, who had needed to adapt from Viking raider to territorial ruler, William was raised from childhood to understand both the military traditions of his Norse heritage and the political responsibilities of Frankish governance. Rollo's approach to preparing William for leadership was methodical and comprehensive. The young man was given increasing responsibilities in ducal administration, allowing him to learn statecraft through practical experience. He was also trained in the military arts, not only the traditional Viking skills of sword and axe, but also the newer techniques of mounted warfare that were becoming dominant in medieval Europe. Perhaps most importantly, he was educated in the diplomatic and cultural skills necessary to maintain relations with neighboring rulers and manage the complex internal politics of the duchy. The religious dimension of William's education was particularly important. While Rollo's own conversion had been primarily political, William's Christianity was genuine and deep-rooted. He was educated by clergy who ensured that he understood both Christian theology and the political implications of Christian rulership. This religious formation would prove crucial in legitimizing Norman rule among the duchy's Frankish subjects and maintaining good relations with the church hierarchy. Rollo also took care to ensure that the succession would have broad support within Norman society. He gradually transferred authority to William while remaining available to provide guidance and support. This process allowed the Norman nobility to become accustomed to William's leadership, while Rollo's own authority provided a safety net against potential challenges. The transition was managed so skillfully that when Rollo formally abdicated in favor of his son around 927, the transfer of power occurred without significant opposition. The circumstances of Rollo's abdication were themselves significant. Rather than waiting until death or incapacity forced a succession crisis, he chose to step down while still in full possession of his faculties. This decision reflected both his confidence in William's abilities and his understanding that a planned succession was more likely to be successful than one forced by circumstances. According to later Norman sources, Rollo spent his final years in retirement, probably at the monastery of Fjords, which he had founded and richly endowed. The image of the old Viking warrior ending his days in Christian contemplation was powerfully symbolic of the transformation that Normandy itself had undergone. The man who had once terrorized the coasts of Europe died peacefully as a Christian duke, surrounded by the institutions he had created and confident in the future of his dynasty. Rollo's death, which probably occurred around 930, marked the end of the founding era of Norman history. But the institutions and traditions he had established proved remarkably durable. William Longsword successfully maintained ducal authority and continued his father's policies of internal development and external expansion. Under his leadership, Normandy continued to grow in strength and influence. The Normandy that emerged under Rollo's leadership was unlike anything that had existed before in medieval Europe. It represented a unique synthesis of Viking military traditions, Frankish administrative practices, and Christian religious culture that would prove to be remarkably creative and influential. Understanding this transformation is crucial to appreciating not only Rollo's personal achievement, but also the broader historical significance of the Norman phenomenon. The most visible aspect of this transformation was architectural. The Normans developed a distinctive building style that combined the massive stone construction techniques they learned from Frankish models with decorative elements that reflected their Scandinavian heritage. Norman churches, with their characteristic rounded arches, thick walls, and imposing towers, became symbols of the new culture that was emerging in the duchy. The Abbey of Jumiages, rebuilt under Rollo's patronage in the early 10th century, exemplifies this architectural synthesis. The church combined traditional Carolingian basilica design with innovations in stone vaulting and tower construction that would later influence ecclesiastical architecture throughout Norman territories. The scale and ambition of these building projects also demonstrated the economic recovery that Normandy had achieved under ducal leadership. But the cultural transformation went far deeper than architecture. The Norman French dialect that developed during this period represented a unique linguistic synthesis that combined the Germanic elements of Old Norse with the Romance elements of Northern French dialects. This language would later become the medium for a rich literary tradition that included some of medieval Europe's most important works of history, romance, and epic poetry. The legal traditions that emerged in Normandy were similarly synthetic. The Normans preserved many elements of Scandinavian customary law, particularly those relating to property rights and inheritance, while adapting them to fit within the broader framework of Frankish legal practice. The result was a legal system that was both flexible and sophisticated, capable of dealing with the complex social relations that characterized Norman society. Norman military organization represented perhaps the most significant innovation of the period. Traditional Viking warfare had been based on infantry tactics, with warriors fighting on foot using swords, axes, and spears. But the Normans gradually adapted to the mounted warfare that was becoming dominant in medieval Europe, developing new techniques that combined the shock power of heavy cavalry with the tactical flexibility of their Scandinavian heritage. This military evolution was not merely a matter of adopting new equipment and techniques. It required fundamental changes in social organization as well. The maintenance of heavy cavalry required a substantial economic foundation, as horses, armor, and weapons were expensive and required constant maintenance. The Norman solution was to develop a sophisticated system of land grants and military obligations that could support a professional warrior class while maintaining territorial defense. The famous Norman heavy cavalry that would later dominate battlefields from Hastings to Antioch was the product of this careful synthesis of military traditions. Norman knights retained the individual courage and tactical flexibility of their Viking ancestors while developing the disciplined coordination necessary for effective cavalry operations. The result was a military force that was arguably the most effective in contemporary Europe. The religious transformation of Normandy was equally significant. The conversion of the Viking settlers to Christianity was not merely a matter of changing formal religious allegiance. It involved the gradual adoption of an entirely different worldview and value system. The process was facilitated by the remarkable efforts of the Norman Church, which managed to preserve Christian traditions while adapting to the cultural needs of their new converts. The monastery of Mont Saint-Michel, which became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in medieval Europe, symbolized this religious transformation. The monastery was established on a site that had probably been sacred to the pagan Vikings before their conversion, but it became a center of Christian learning and devotion that attracted pilgrims from throughout Europe. The synthesis of pagan and Christian elements in Norman religious culture created a distinctive spiritual tradition that was both deeply devout and remarkably tolerant. Educational and intellectual developments in Normandy were closely connected to this religious transformation. The Norman Church established schools and scriptoriums that became centers of learning and book production. Norman scholars made important contributions to medieval theology, philosophy, and historical writing. The intellectual climate of Normandy was characterized by a remarkable openness to new ideas and influences, perhaps reflecting the cultural synthesis that had created Norman society itself. The economic transformation of Normandy was equally impressive. Within a generation of the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, the duchy had become one of the most prosperous regions of northern Europe. Agriculture recovered and expanded, with new techniques and crops being introduced. Urban life revived, with towns like Rouen and Caen becoming important commercial centers. Maritime trade flourished, as Norman merchants established connections with England, Ireland, the Low Countries, and the Mediterranean. This economic success was not accidental. It reflected the conscious policies of Rollo and his successors, who understood that political stability and military security were meaningless without underlying economic prosperity. The Norman dukes invested heavily in infrastructure development, establishing markets and fairs, improving roads and harbors, and providing the legal framework necessary for commercial activity. Perhaps most significantly, the Normans developed a distinctive approach to expansion and colonization that would prove remarkably successful. Rather than simply conquering and exploiting new territories, they demonstrated a remarkable ability to adapt their political and cultural institutions to local conditions while maintaining their essential Norman identity. This flexibility would prove crucial to their later successes in England, southern Italy, and the Holy Land. The transformation of Normandy under Rollo's leadership created a model for medieval statecraft that was both innovative and practical. The synthesis of different cultural traditions, the adaptation of military techniques to changing conditions, and the creation of institutions that could provide both stability and flexibility. All of these elements would influence medieval European development far beyond the boundaries of the original duchy. The true measure of Rollo's historical significance becomes clear only when we consider the extraordinary achievements of his descendants. The dynasty he founded would go on to accomplish feats of conquest and state-building that rank among the most impressive in medieval history. From the conquest of England to the establishment of kingdoms in Sicily and the Holy Land, the Normans would demonstrate a remarkable capacity for military success, political innovation, and cultural adaptation. The most famous of these achievements was undoubtedly the Norman conquest of England in 1066. William the Conqueror, Rollo's great-great-great-grandson, led an army of Norman knights across the English Channel to claim the English throne at the Battle of Hastings. The victory that day would transform not only England but the entire political and cultural landscape of medieval Europe. The connection between Rollo's original settlement in Normandy and the conquest of England illustrates the long-term significance of the transformations he had initiated. The military effectiveness that made the conquest possible was a direct result of the synthesis of Viking and Frankish military traditions that had occurred in Normandy. The administrative skills that allowed the Normans to govern their new English territories were rooted in the institutional innovations that Rollo had pioneered. Even the cultural confidence that enabled the Normans to adapt to English conditions while maintaining their distinctive identity reflected the experience of successful cultural synthesis that had begun with Rollo's conversion and continued through successive generations. But the Norman achievement went far beyond England. In southern Italy and Sicily, Norman adventurers established kingdoms that would endure for centuries and play crucial roles in Mediterranean politics. The Norman principalities in Italy demonstrated the same combination of military effectiveness, administrative sophistication, and cultural adaptability that had characterized the original Duchy of Normandy. The Norman role in the Crusades was equally significant. Norman knights were among the most effective military leaders of the First Crusade, and Norman states in the Holy Land, particularly the Principality of Antioch, became bulwarks of Christian power in the eastern Mediterranean. The success of Norman crusaders reflected not only their military skills, but also their ability to adapt to the complex political and cultural conditions of the Middle East. These achievements were not merely the result of individual military prowess. They reflected the institutional and cultural foundations that Rollo had established in Normandy. The system of ducal government that he had created provided a model for effective territorial administration that could be adapted to different circumstances. The military organization that had evolved in Normandy created a professional warrior class that was both highly effective in battle and capable of governing conquered territories. The cultural synthesis that had occurred in Normandy provided a foundation for further adaptation and innovation in new environments. Perhaps most significantly, the Norman expansion demonstrated the continuing vitality of the cultural model that Rollo had pioneered. In each of their new territories, the Normans showed the same capacity for cultural synthesis that had characterized their original settlement in France. They adopted local customs and practices where appropriate while maintaining their distinctive identity and institutional advantages. This flexibility was a crucial factor in their ability to establish lasting political structures in such diverse environments. The influence of Norman achievements extended far beyond the territories they directly controlled. Norman innovations in military technology and tactics influenced warfare throughout Europe. Norman architectural styles spread from England to Sicily to the Holy Land. Norman legal and administrative practices were adopted by neighboring rulers who recognized their effectiveness. Norman French became the language of aristocratic culture throughout much of medieval Europe. The intellectual and cultural contributions of the Normans were equally significant. Norman scholars made important contributions to medieval theology, philosophy, and science. Norman chroniclers produced some of the most important historical works of the medieval period, including detailed accounts of the Crusades and the development of European kingdoms. Norman poets and romance writers created literary works that would influence European culture for centuries. The development of English common law, which would eventually spread throughout the British Empire and influence legal systems around the world, was profoundly shaped by Norman legal innovations. The combination of flexibility and systematic organization that characterized Norman law provided a model that would influence legal development for centuries. The economic impact of Norman expansion was equally significant. Perhaps most importantly, the Norman achievement demonstrated the possibility of successful cultural adaptation and political innovation in the medieval world. The transformation that began with Rollo's settlement in Normandy showed that seemingly rigid cultural and religious boundaries could be crossed, that new forms of political organization could be created, and that military conquest could be transformed into constructive governance. The story of Rollo represents one of history's most remarkable examples of personal transformation and cultural adaptation. The Viking raider who terrorized the coasts of Europe became the Christian duke who founded one of medieval Europe's most successful states. The pagan warrior who knew only the culture of the warband became the ruler who created a sophisticated system of territorial government. The exile from Norway became the ancestor of kings who would rule in England, Sicily, and Jerusalem. But Rollo's significance extends far beyond his personal achievements. His story illuminates broader themes in medieval European history, the process of cultural synthesis that created new forms of European civilization, the adaptation of political institutions to changing circumstances, and the transformation of military conquest into constructive governance. The Normandy that Rollo created became a laboratory for political and cultural innovation that would influence European development for centuries. The legacy of Rollo's achievement can be traced through the subsequent history of Europe. The Norman conquest of England created a new form of Anglo-Norman culture that would influence English development until the late medieval period. The Norman kingdoms in southern Italy and Sicily played crucial roles in the development of Renaissance civilization. The Norman participation in the Crusades helped to establish lasting connections between Western Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. Even more broadly, Rollo's career demonstrated the possibility of successful adaptation and innovation in medieval society. At a time when European civilization seemed rigid and unchanging, he showed that new cultural forms could emerge from the creative synthesis of different traditions. His transformation from Viking raider to Christian duke provided a model for the kind of cultural adaptation that would become increasingly important as European society grew more complex and interconnected. The institutions that Rollo created in Normandy, the system of ducal government, the synthesis of military traditions, the integration of different legal systems, the accommodation of different religious and cultural practices, all provided models that would influence political development throughout medieval Europe. The success of these innovations demonstrated that effective governance required not rigid adherence to traditional forms, but creative adaptation to changing circumstances. The influence of Rollo's legacy can be seen not only in the obvious achievements of his descendants, but in the subtler ways that Norman innovations influenced European development. The administrative techniques developed in Normandy provided models for royal government that were adopted throughout medieval Europe. The military innovations of the Normans influenced the development of medieval warfare and the evolution of knightly culture. The legal synthesis that occurred in Normandy contributed to the development of more sophisticated legal systems throughout Europe. Perhaps most significantly, the cultural synthesis that Rollo pioneered in Normandy provided a model for the kind of creative adaptation that would become increasingly necessary as European society grew more complex and interconnected. The ability to preserve essential cultural identity while adapting to new circumstances, to maintain military effectiveness while developing sophisticated governmental institutions, to bridge religious and cultural divides while creating new forms of political organization. These capabilities would prove essential to the success of medieval European civilization. The economic innovations that emerged from Norman society also had lasting influence. The commercial techniques developed by Norman merchants, the agricultural innovations introduced in Norman territories, and the urban development patterns established in Norman cities all provided models that were copied throughout medieval Europe. The prosperity that Normandy achieved under Rollo's leadership demonstrated that effective governance could create conditions for economic growth, even in the challenging circumstances of the early medieval period. The religious and intellectual developments that occurred in Normandy were equally influential. The synthesis of Christian and secular learning that characterized Norman schools and monasteries provided a model for educational development throughout medieval Europe. The theological and philosophical innovations of Norman scholars contributed to the broader development of medieval intellectual culture. The historical chronicles produced in Normandy became important sources for our understanding of medieval European development. The architectural innovations of the Normans had perhaps the most visible and lasting impact. Norman Romanesque architecture, with its distinctive combination of massive stone construction and sophisticated decorative elements, influenced building throughout medieval Europe and beyond. The cathedrals, castles, and monasteries built in the Norman style became symbols not only of Norman achievement but of medieval European civilization itself. The political innovations that Rollo pioneered in Normandy proved to be remarkably durable and influential. The system of ducal government that he created provided a model for effective territorial administration that was adopted by rulers throughout medieval Europe. The combination of central authority and local autonomy that characterized Norman governance offered solutions to political problems that would challenge medieval rulers for centuries. The military innovations of the Normans had equally lasting impact. The development of heavy cavalry as an effective military force, the integration of infantry and cavalry tactics, the construction of sophisticated fortifications, and the development of siege warfare techniques. All of these innovations influenced military development throughout medieval Europe. The professional warrior class that emerged in Normandy provided a model for knightly culture that would dominate European military organization for centuries. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Rollo's legacy was his demonstration that successful political leadership required not just military strength, but also the ability to adapt to changing circumstances and to create new forms of political and cultural organization. His transformation from Viking raider to Christian duke showed that effective leadership required both the courage to embrace change and the wisdom to preserve what was valuable from the past. The story of Rollo also illustrates the importance of timing and opportunity in historical development. His career coincided with a period of political fragmentation and cultural change that created opportunities for innovative leadership. The decline of Carolingian authority, the pressure of Viking expansion, the need for new forms of political organization, all of these factors created conditions that favored the kind of adaptive leadership that Rollo provided. Yet Rollo's success was not simply a matter of being in the right place at the right time. His achievement required exceptional personal qualities, military skill, political intelligence, cultural adaptability, and the vision to see possibilities that others missed. The transformation that he accomplished was not inevitable but required conscious choice and sustained effort over many years. The process of cultural synthesis that Rollo initiated in Normandy provides insights into how new forms of civilization emerge from the interaction of different cultural traditions. The Norman achievement was not simply a matter of imposing Viking culture on a Frankish population or of Vikings adopting Frankish ways. Rather, it involved the creative synthesis of different traditions to create something genuinely new. A hybrid culture that combined the strengths of both traditions while adapting to the specific circumstances of its time and place. This process of cultural synthesis required not only individual leadership but also the cooperation of many different groups and interests. The success of Norman society depended on the willingness of both Vikings and Franks to embrace new forms of cultural identity, on the ability of the Church to adapt Christian traditions to new circumstances, and on the development of institutions that could accommodate different cultural practices while maintaining overall coherence. The economic transformation of Normandy under Rollo's leadership also provides insights into the relationship between political stability and economic prosperity. The recovery of Normandy from the devastation of the Viking raids was not automatic but required conscious policies designed to encourage resettlement, restore agricultural production, and revive commercial activity. Rollo's success in creating conditions for economic growth demonstrated that effective governance could overcome even severe economic disruption. The military innovations that occurred in Normandy illustrate the dynamic relationship between military technology, social organization, and political development. The evolution from Viking infantry tactics to Norman heavy cavalry was not simply a matter of adopting new equipment but required fundamental changes in social and economic organization. The development of a professional warrior class supported by agricultural rents represented a new form of military organization that would influence European development for centuries. The religious transformation of Normandy provides insights into the complex process of Christianization in medieval Europe. The conversion of the Viking settlers was not simply a matter of formal religious change, but involved the gradual transformation of worldview, value systems, and cultural practices. The success of this transformation depended on the ability of the Church to adapt its missionary strategies to the cultural needs of its new converts while maintaining essential Christian doctrines. The legal innovations that occurred in Normandy illustrate the creative possibilities that emerge from the interaction of different legal traditions. The synthesis of Viking and Frankish legal practices created new approaches to property rights, inheritance, and governance that proved both flexible and effective. These innovations would later influence legal development throughout the Norman sphere of influence and contribute to the evolution of European legal systems. The intellectual and educational developments in Normandy demonstrate the importance of cultural synthesis in promoting learning and innovation. The combination of Christian and secular learning traditions, the interaction between different cultural perspectives, and the practical needs of governing a complex society all contributed to the intellectual vitality that characterized Norman culture. As we reflect on the story of Rollo and the founding of Normandy, we can see that his achievement represents more than just the success of an individual leader or even the creation of a successful medieval state. It represents a demonstration of the human capacity for adaptation, innovation, and cultural creativity. In transforming himself from Viking raider to Christian duke, Rollo showed that seemingly insurmountable cultural and religious barriers could be overcome through intelligent leadership and sustained effort. The legacy of Rollo's achievement extends far beyond the medieval period. The political innovations that he pioneered, the cultural synthesis that he initiated, and the institutional foundations that he created all contributed to developments that would influence European civilization for centuries. The Norman achievements in England, Italy, and the Holy Land were all built on foundations that Rollo had established in the early 10th century. But perhaps the most important lesson of Rollo's story is that successful leadership requires not just strength and courage, but also the wisdom to recognize when change is necessary and the skill to manage that change effectively. In an age that is often characterized as rigid and unchanging, Rollo demonstrated that creative adaptation was not only possible but essential for success. The transformation that Rollo accomplished in Normandy provides a model for understanding how new forms of civilization emerge from the interaction of different cultural traditions. It shows that such transformations require not just individual leadership, but the cooperation of many different groups and the development of institutions that can accommodate diversity while maintaining coherence. As our tale draws to a close, we can see that Rollo's story is ultimately one of transformation and possibility. The Viking raider who once terrorized the coasts of Europe became the founder of a dynasty that would rule kingdoms from England to Sicily. The pagan warrior who knew only the culture of violence became the Christian duke who created one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated states. The exile from Norway became the ancestor of some of medieval Europe's most successful rulers. But more than that, Rollo's story demonstrates that human beings have the capacity to transform not only themselves but the societies in which they live. His achievement shows that with vision, courage, and persistence, it is possible to create new forms of political and cultural organization that can endure for centuries and influence the development of entire civilizations. The Normandy that Rollo created became a model for medieval European statecraft, demonstrating that effective governance required not rigid adherence to tradition, but creative adaptation to changing circumstances. The cultural synthesis that he initiated provided a foundation for developments that would influence European civilization far beyond the boundaries of his original duchy. Today, more than 1,000 years after Rollo first set foot on Norman soil, we can still see the influence of his achievement. The legal systems, architectural styles, and political institutions that trace their origins to Norman innovations continue to shape our world. The example of successful cultural adaptation that he provided remains relevant in our own age of cultural change and global interaction. The story of Rollo reminds us that history is not just the chronicle of what happened in the past, but a source of insight into the possibilities and challenges that face human societies in every age. As we conclude our journey through the remarkable life of Rollo the Walker, we are reminded that the past is not simply a foreign country, but a source of wisdom and inspiration for our own time. The challenges that Rollo faced, the need to adapt to changing circumstances, to bridge cultural and religious divides, to create new forms of political organization, are challenges that continue to face human societies today. His success in meeting these challenges provides both inspiration and guidance for those who seek to build better societies in our own time. The story of Rollo shows us that with vision, courage, and the willingness to embrace change, it is possible to transform not only ourselves but the world around us. And so we leave Rollo, the Viking who became a duke, the raider who became a ruler, the Norseman whose legacy continues to influence our world today. His story reminds us that the greatest transformations often begin with a single individual who has the courage to imagine a different future and the persistence to make that future real. In the windswept fjords of Norway and the rolling hills of Normandy, in the halls of medieval castles and the pages of history books, the legend of Rollo the Walker lives on, inspiring new generations to believe in the possibility of transformation and the power of human achievement. The footsteps of the giant who was too large for any horse echo still through the corridors of time, reminding us that sometimes the most unlikely people, in the most challenging circumstances, can achieve the most extraordinary things. This has been the story of Rollo Viking, Duke, founder, and legend. May his example inspire us all to embrace the transformations that our own age demands and to build legacies worthy of remembrance for generations yet to come. Thank you for joining us on this remarkable journey through history. Until next time, this has been History Bedtime Stories, where the past comes alive to inspire the present and illuminate the future. Sweet dreams, dear listeners, and may your own adventures be filled with the courage and wisdom of Rollo the Walker.